full disclosure, Jack and I are old friends. He's somebody I like very much and whose commitment to public service has been something I've admired very much for many years. So this is not going to be a Jeremy Paxman screw him to the wall and try to humiliate him.
And I once offered him a job.
Yes.
And he said no.
There was that, yeah. So that if you want to be Jeremy Paxman, by all means, that's fine. We'll come to you in a few minutes. But Jack, let me start by asking you about what Jack did next. I remember seeing you about 10 days after you lost power in 2007, and you were relaxed and funny and good fun, and I thought he looks like a man who's just got out of jail. Were you relieved to lose power?
I wasn't relieved to not be First Minister anymore. I would dearly have liked to still be First Minister. I think at that point I was relieved that that particular moment was over. The period between, there was about 2 weeks between the election day and the election of the new First Minister. And I had to clear out Bute House and congratulate Alex and all that kind of thing. And that was an emotionally challenging 10 days.
Yeah. And if you could have looked into a crystal ball and seen what was to happen in 2011, and then indeed in 2015, you wouldn't have believed it, would you? Back then, we wouldn't have believed that the Labour would be reduced to one MP at Westminster in Scotland.
Oh no, I don't think it would have been possible to predict that. But I think we were in very uncertain times, and they were made even more uncertain by the way in which economics and politics changed dramatically in the year or two after that. So I think we were definitely it felt like we were in a new era, but it felt like a very unpredictable era. And at least for the first few years afterwards, there were lots of ups and downs. It's only really been maybe a more consistent direction of travel over the last 4 years.
Well, let's talk about the post-May 2015 situation a bit later, but let's go on to you were elevated to a peerage of the kingdom, peerage of the realm. How did that feel? I mean, as a young socialist, you would have despised that, wouldn't you? When you and I first knew each other, the House of Lords, really?
It felt very weird, I have to say. It still feels very weird when I'm there, partly because most of Margaret Thatcher's cabinet are still there, and they're still sitting on the other side in a row, which almost takes you back in time. It felt strange, but I talked to people I trust at the time. I've always had a group of people that I trust to give me very good advice, and I spoke to them, and they said, you are, at that point I was still only in my 40s, and you've got they thought, I've still got lots to offer, and here is a platform through which to espouse the causes that you feel passionately about. So at the end of the day, I didn't hesitate. I thought about it, but I didn't hesitate.
What's interesting to me is that you've been able to, you've at least been trying to apply the lessons you learned running a devolved government within a larger union to other parts of the world. How has that worked out? How did you get into that?
Well, apart from being interested in Scotland and Scottish devolution and Scottish politics all my adult life, I had also had an interest which came, I think, from watching the Soweto massacre on television in my teens in Arran, where there was no international politics going on at all. I'd also always had an interest in Africa and conflict. And when I finished as First Minister, there was some talk of me going to Malawi as Ambassador, as High Commissioner. And then a year on, I was asked.
Let me just stop you. There wasn't some talk. It was
I was appointed.
Going.
I'd pretty much signed the contract.
So why didn't you go?
Well, I was asked by. I was approached by Mark Malach Brown, who had been appointed to the Foreign Office by Gordon Brown at that time. And Mark Malach Brown had a history in the UN. You may have come across him over the years. He was Kofi Annan's number 2 for a number of years. And he was very strongly committed to peace building as a development of peacekeeping and around the world, and he thought Britain could do more on that. And he persuaded me not to go to Malawi, but instead to do what was essentially a voluntary position at that time with the Foreign Office to promote this case for peace building. So I got more involved in that side of international politics, which was very motivating, very interesting, kind of captured me to some extent, I suppose. And what I've tried to do over recent years is take my experience of devolved government in Scotland, and use that in conflict situations where devolution has to be part of the solution.
For example, Philippines.
Well, for example, at the moment I'm involved in the Philippines. And the Philippines has had a lot of conflict over the years, but in the last 40 years, the main conflict has been between the Islamic minority in the main southern island of Mindanao and the largely Catholic majority and the government. And that the Islamic Front organisation signed a peace deal last year, which sees them accept the sovereignty of the Philippine state and lay down their arms in return for a sizable measure of devolution to their part of the country called the Bangsamoro. And a bit like Northern Ireland to some extent, but a more open peace deal, and I think maybe one that's a bit more likely to lead to action right away, real change for people. And I've been helping now for about a year, both the Philippine government get this right, but also helping the Islamic Front organisation change, which is a big challenge for them, change from being involved in armed conflict to becoming politicians who can actually run a government in their area. And I think this is a model. I've talked to Mark as well about Beyond Borders being involved in some of this. It's a model that needs to work elsewhere, because almost all of the conflicts that we see on our TV screens night after night, week after week, involve a big country where a region or a historic nation within that country feels disenfranchised from the centre, discriminated against, whatever. And around the world, whether it's in the Congo or northern Nigeria or parts of the Middle East or Ukraine or the Philippines or Burma, whatever, the solution has to be, permanent political solution has to be some form of devolution. And there are me and a number of others around who I think can help with that.
I lived in South Africa for a time and got to know Bishop Desmond Tutu a bit, although I always say to him, every time I see you, Bishop Tutu, you never know who I am, you never remember that I've met you before. And he looked at me and he laughed, he said, yes, that's very true, I never do remember. But he got involved in the Northern Ireland peace process. Yeah. So, because he could bring with him the experience of the transition in South Africa,
yeah,
with which he was very deeply involved, but also an immense moral credibility and moral authority. When you cite Scotland as an example, are they interested? Do they care about the Scottish experience in say the Philippines?
Well, the thing about the Scottish model of devolution, if it survives the current political scenario, it is very strong and autonomous. And the Scottish Parliament has more power than most similar institutions anywhere in the world. But it's also very, very tightly bound into the framework of the United Kingdom and actually also the European Union in our case. So it is a really interesting example of autonomy within a wider shared sovereignty. And that now these days works for the Northern Ireland Assembly as well. And while the people who were involved in creating the peace settlement in Northern Ireland and the Assembly there are now involved, like Tutu was in his time, in peace negotiations around the world and losing their experience for that. There are not that many people around the world who are helping in countries that are not their own, but have run a devolved government. And when I finished as First Minister, I was only 46. I mean, I had been very, very fortunate to have that job for a number of years, so young, and I was desperately trying to think, what can I do next that uses this experience but uses the energy and passion that I've still got? And I've sort of found this area of work which uses the Scottish experience but at the same time uses my interest in other continents and other situations.
And is there a community of you of leaders of former leaders of devolved government?
That's the vision. The vision is that there would be at some point. There are people around. There's one other person who has a similar background to me who is involved in this kind of work is a guy called Yves Leterme, who was the First Minister or the Premier of Flanders in Belgium when I was First Minister in Scotland, and we had quite a good, close working relationship then. He has gone on to work in international development. He now runs a big NGO called IDEA in Stockholm that's involved in governance. And there are other people like him around the world, and my sort of vision for this is that a group of us will offer our services in these post-conflict environments to help devolve government as a permanent, peaceful political settlement actually work in practice.
I want to ask you one more question before we come on to the current political situation. Which
Do you have to?
You have. Well, you were happy to talk to Newsnight last night.
This is cheerful so far.
The question is the referendum. You know, one of the things that struck me, and I was just knackered at the end of the referendum because I was covering it for BBC Television News. I found it very difficult, quite tense, and exhausting. But on the next day, I thought, you know what, Scotland emerges from this with some credibility and moral legitimacy, because there aren't many parts of the world where questions of such a fundamental nature are resolved with no bombs and no bullets, and maybe a couple of eggs. No bombs, no bullets, one egg. I was quite proud of Scotland for that. I was quite proud of the way that Scotland had pulled that off, and I was also quite proud of the British democratic tradition that had enabled that to happen. Do you think that matters in the world, in the context of the kind of work that you're doing now? Do you think that experience matters?
Yes, it absolutely does, and I think we take a lot of this for granted in this country. You know, there are a relatively small number of countries in the world where elections are run as independently, or referenda are run as independently and as credibly as they are in Scotland and the UK. And I think the referendum was our most recent example of this, but I think the way in which we resolve our differences through a political process and a popular vote is very, very powerful. And obviously there are a number of others in Europe, although even some of these are challenged. You know, look at Italy in recent years, certainly until the current government, with the way in which, I mean, people used to say that if Italy applied to join the European Union now,
wouldn't get in.
With the Prime Minister owning most of the media,
yeah,
they wouldn't get in for reasons of lack of democracy. Look at America, where George Bush almost certainly was not elected president, but became president because his brother's state changed the voting system on the day. You know, so it's not just in other continents and in the global south that this is an issue. And I think in most of Western Europe, and it's certainly in Scotland and the UK, we should take more pride in what we achieve by the democratic process, and we should advocate that more passionately internationally. We've got credibility on it, and we should use it.
The interesting thing about the referendum was that the Better Together side won the referendum, but the Labour Party spectacularly lost it. And we saw the result of that in May this year. What on earth went wrong for Labour?
I think the roots of this year go further back than the referendum. I think the referendum contributed to it, but I don't think it was, and it was certainly a catalyst for, and the aftermath of the referendum was a catalyst for the decline becoming more serious. But I think the roots are much further back than that, and to some extent it's not just the Labour Party. I think the three main Westminster parties have consistently failed.
But Labour won. You can tie yourself to the other two unionist parties, but Labour won every election in Scotland for half a century. Mm-hmm. And in fact, you know, you were the first Labour leader to lose an election in half a century. Why? Why did a party that enjoyed such dominance just suddenly fall off a cliff?
Well, I think there was a lack of recognition of the way in which the United Kingdom had fundamentally changed, and the way in which devolution gave a democratic expression to that was more than just a civic movement or the Church of Scotland or whatever had been there in the past. And I think two things happened at the centre, and it affected the Labour Party, yes, more than the other parties, but it was very much an issue between the Westminster and London establishment, the south east of England metropolitan establishment, and Scotland, to some extent Wales, where people didn't see coming the resurgence of Welsh identity and confidence that's happened over these years as well. And they just didn't see the change. And the UK is now, in my view, UK is now a multinational, multicultural state in which sovereignty is shared. And that is a very different model from the one Great Britain approach, which I think is still being talked about by all parties. I mean, I remember when Ed Miliband 2 years ago came up with his slogan for the election campaign of One Nation. And I had in my hands watching the television. I mean, just, I couldn't believe it. I thought this country is no longer one nation. And unless you recognise that, you're never going to be Prime Minister. And then I despaired the day after the general election this year when the current Prime Minister used the same phrase. He's learned nothing either. And I just...
but it's all right for the current Prime Minister to use that phrase, because you can't really punish the Tories anymore, with the greatest respect to Ruth Davidson if she's still here. You can't punish the Tories anymore, because they're down to their hardcore base of support, and they're not likely to sink any further. You can really punish Labour, though, and the people did.
The people did. And I think people saw that we had lost touch. We had... I think the party had become in government, identified with a distance from the people. The reality is that things like although again, every party was involved in this and lots of individuals who've escaped scrutiny were involved in it, things like MPs' expenses, things like decisions made, it appears, on false evidence to go to war, things like a refusal to have public inquiries into things that deserve public inquiries. All these things where government seemed distant from the people, they happened on our watch. And people don't forget that. And the moment in Scotland that might find expression in, a belief in or resurgence of Scottish identity, or just a belief in the fact that Nicola and her team represent a more democratic approach to government or whatever. But I think that the roots of all this come from a detachment from the people and a sense that Labour had got detached for whatever reason. And I think the referendum campaign was another example of that. The referendum campaign, I think I spoke twice on Better Together platforms. I was I dismayed at the campaign. I just thought that, again, there was no vision for what the UK was. Why should people in Scotland stay part of the UK? What was the positive reason? And nobody was putting across that vision. Nobody was talking about the Scotland that we live in today, not the one that we used to live in. And nobody was talking about ambitions for the country. And I think people have been very forgiving of the SNP. I think the Scottish Government's done a fantastic job over the last few years. I don't think... I'm very careful not to be too critical of my successors. But I don't think the list of achievements is huge.
But there's 60% in the opinion.
That's what I'm going to say. But they are forgiven all that because they appear to have an ambition for Scotland and a commitment to making a better Scotland and making lives better in Scotland. And the Labour Party completely sold the pass on that, and they in many ways deserve to pay a price for it. In my opinion.
There's a good argument that the situation is even more dire than your interpretation of it would suggest, and it's that it's not just that the Labour leadership in both Scotland and the United Kingdom made a series of mistakes that demonstrated that they were no longer in touch with the people. It is possible that there is no longer a people to be in touch with. Labour's traditional industrial working class base has disappeared in the last 30 years. So those communities that ran, if in the 1970s you were an SNP canvasser going around West Central Scotland arguing for Scottish independence, people on the doorsteps would say, but I work for something called British Steel, British shipbuilders. They pay 5 weeks holiday a year, they'll pay me a pension one day. Are you going to unpick all that? Those communities, those industrial working class communities, were bedrocks of Labour loyalty and also British identity in Scotland. And you've got to be in your 50s now to remember them, really. And the danger for Labour is that those bedrocks of British identity on which Labour rested in Scotland have gone. So there is no longer a community to be in touch with that is naturally and automatically going to vote Labour. This could be an existential moment for the Labour Party in Scotland, couldn't it?
The one thing I would say about that is that most of those institutions had gone before 1997.
But the memory, there's a lag. There's the folk memory of them.
But they still had gone. The day-to-day engagement with those industrial institutions had gone prior to 1997, and that didn't stop Labour at that point being in touch with what people were wanting around the country and expressing that and getting their support, including in the borders where in the past we hadn't had much support. And I think what's been wrong has been the inability of the next generation of Labour leaders or potential Labour leaders and the party as a whole to express where the UK and where Scotland is now, not where it was then, and do that and speak in a 21st century way about 21st century ambitions and problems, and I think and as a result, I think we lost touch. So it's partly that. There are still British institutions though, and you've still got, for example, an oil and gas industry in Scotland that is very, very important.
It's private sector. It's private sector. It's not a British public institution.
Yeah, but it's still an important employer where people know a lot of money's at stake and a lot of jobs are at stake, and an important contributor to the economy. Between September last year and May this year, the price of oil dropped in half. The previously exposed economic case numbers for independence, to some extent, at least in the short term, fell apart with it. And yet more people voted for pro-independence positions in May than they did back in September. Now that means this is not about numbers, it's not about institutions, it's about feelings, it's about ambitions, emotions, concerns, worries, and which party is best reflecting them at the moment. And I think that's why the Nationalists have been doing so well, and I think it's why Labour, because Labour got out of touch with that, I think that's why they have been punished, and punished they were.
Let me ask you about the Labour leadership contest.
It just goes from bad to worse, doesn't it?
It's a disaster, isn't it? But it's... Yeah.
Can we go back to the previous topic?
You were on the Radio 4 news bulletins this morning saying it was a shambles. What can be done about it? Is whoever wins going to emerge with any credibility?
Well, whoever wins has had a difficult job before this process, and they're going to have an even more difficult one afterwards. I mean, I think the rules are bonkers, but I think to some extent I think it adds to what I've just been saying, because I think at some point there were a group of people in a room, most of whom have been around a long time, all of whom have got serious responsibilities, and the fact that none of them saw that having the membership of an organisation open at a fifth of the normal price during an election vote, it might be a problem, kind of sums up just how out of touch they are. So, I mean, I think it's a ridiculous situation that we're in, but at the same time, the rules were set, everybody's campaigned on the same rules, everybody accepted the rules at the beginning, all of the candidates. In fact, the three candidates who are perceived to be not benefiting from these rules were probably all involved in setting them, whereas the one that's winning wasn't.
But
and
it doesn't.
I think they all need to accept. You have to accept the rules and stop discussing the rules. What people want to hear from the Labour Party is what's your vision, what's your ambitions for the country, and to have candidates spending the first week of the actual vote in this process, which was last week, talking about the process and not talking about what they want to do for the country.
But the process is important because a party that spectacularly has been unable to organise its own its leadership election, is going to go to the country in 5 years' time and say, please let us run the country. And if it can't run its own leadership election, why should we trust it to run the country?
Well, I think you should be very grateful the next general election's not in October. Certainly. I mean, I think there'll be a lot of things will happen between now and 2020. But I think right now, I mean, the idea of a bigger membership and people being able to join a political party if they're motivated to do so is great. We all decry a lack of activity and engagement in politics, and so the actual principle behind this whole setup is actually quite good and long overdue. It was about reducing the power of the trade union leaders and having individual mass membership. That's all great. But to do it in the middle of an election campaign is just naive. And I think that's where the mistake has been made. But it's been the same rules for everybody. They need to move on, and they need to talk about their vision for the country and stop talking about the process and let other people do that.
It's Jeremy Corbyn and 3 former special advisors, isn't it? That's the candidate list. Let me ask you something. I'm going to come to the audience in a second, but I want to ask you to comment on this observation about the Labour front bench. There was a piece in the New Statesman about 4 years ago after Ed Miliband became leader, and it said, take 3 age groups in the Labour, those born between 1945 and 55, those born between 55 and 65, which is our age group, and those born between 65 and 75. Are you still with me? And ask yourself, of the top 4 positions in the Labour Party, Prime Minister, Chancellor, Foreign Secretary, Home Secretary, or their shadows, how many people from each of those 3 groups has held at least one of those 4 posts? So in the first group, it's Brown and Blair and Jack Straw and Robin Cook and John Reid and Margaret Beckett and Alistair Darling and any number. In the third, the youngest of those groups, it's Yvette Cooper and Ed Balls and both the Miliband brothers and several others as well. In that middle group, how many? Ballpark figure. Our age group.
I would guess perhaps 2.
1.
Jackie Smith. Yeah.
There's a missing generation.
Absolutely.
Why did that happen?
Oh, this will bore everybody to death. Why I think this has happened.
Right. 40 seconds.
If you allow me a moment, I put this to some extent down to the creation in the 1980s of larger political offices for members of Parliament. And what happened then was that people who would in the past have gone into a normal job and did their politics on a voluntary basis, as I did. I was a mathematics teacher during the day and did my politics at night and at weekends. But people who wanted to go to be involved in political activity got jobs with MPs. That gave them a privileged position and access to all the MPs' supporters in their constituency. So when the MP retires, they're in a better position to take over from them. And gradually, over 25 years, more and more of those kind of people, not just in the Labour Party, but in the other parties as well, have become the members of Parliament. And the number of people who have come from backgrounds where they've held a different kind of full-time job has become smaller and smaller and smaller. And I think that is one of the reasons why we've got the situation that we're in. In the last Parliament, between 2010 and 2015, the 4 most senior positions in the opposition Labour Party were all held by people who worked in the same office when Gordon Brown was Shadow Chancellor. The 2 Eds, Douglas Alexander and Yvette Cooper, all 4 of them worked in the same office. They shared desks at one point in Gordon Brown's early days as Shadow Chancellor and Chancellor. Now that's not healthy for a political party, and it's one of the reasons we're in the mess that we're in.
Does it reflect a certain control freakery on the part of Gordon Brown?
I think it reflects a certain control freakery on the part of I don't like
personalising
talking about the New Labour establishment because there were good things in New Labour, believe it or not. But and I don't like to personalise it too much around one person because other people were always involved. But I think the consistent pattern over the years, the attempt initially in Wales to stop Rodri Morgan becoming First Minister and impose that other guy who became a disaster, Rod or Ron or somebody. The attempt in Scotland to stop me becoming party leader and impose Henry McLeish. The attempt in London to stop Ken Livingstone becoming London Mayor. And then the attempt after Tony Blair went to have a smooth handover between him and Gordon Brown without an election. All of these things, I think, have contributed to a feeling amongst ordinary party members that they were not listened to, they were not part of the process, and that then fed into wider feelings amongst Labour voters. And I think until the party behaves like a proper democratic organisation again, it will struggle to rebuild the enthusiasm and the motivation that's needed for a centre-left party to regrow. And it may be too late. PASOK in Greece were in government 5 years ago. The equivalent of the Labour Party in Greece were in government 5 years ago. Today they are polling less than 5% in Greek opinion polls. And even if Syriza split, as they're about to do in the Greek government, into 2 different parties, both of those parties will be larger than what used to be the Labour Party in Greece. And if we don't get our act together quickly, then we're heading in the same direction.
So it is existential, isn't it?
I think it's close to being that. Yes.
Does it remind you of the Liberals after 1906? They won a landslide victory, and then they collapsed. They disappeared.
It's very similar conditions. Very similar conditions.
Before I open it up to the audience, let me ask you who you're going to vote for. Are you going to tell us?
Me.
Which of the four? Which of the four are you going to vote for?
I have voted, and I think I'm not going to say publicly who I voted for, but I've tried not to do that in leadership elections so far. But I like the idea of us having a female leader, and I want somebody who's going to tell. And I want somebody to tell us the truth. You can draw your own conclusions from that.
So not Jeremy Corbyn or Andy Burnham.
But can I also say that I work very closely. I mean, Anera, you and I both know well the Congo.
Yeah.
Jeremy Corbyn and I have worked very closely on the Congo and Rwanda over the last few years in Parliament. I'm the Lord's co-chair of the all-party group on that part of Africa, and Jeremy's the House of Commons co-chair. And I have found him as somebody to work with, genuine, honest, and quite relaxed in discussion, not dogmatic. I think one of the reasons he's doing well is that he's not like a lot of people who are identified with the far left. Most people identified with the far left tend to be over dogmatic, or they tend to be hypocrites. I don't think Jeremy's either of those two things. I think that's one of the reasons why he's doing so well.
The pet cat of a BuzzFeed reporter has voted for Yvette Cooper.
There you go.
I mean, these stories are going to keep drip coming out over the next year or two.
Well, there was a story on Newsnight last night about a Tory hereditary peer who I know who's also involved in the Congo Party group, ironically, who'd signed up to join, I think, Tower Hamlets or something in London, and the local party had identified him and pulled him out. But there'll be people all over the country who've joined. But they're a relatively small number. You know, there's tens of.
How do we know that? How do we know?
There are tens of thousands of people that have joined over the summer in this scheme where, if you're a member of a trade union, you can join the party cheaply. The idea that there would be, and I can imagine there might be a few thousand Trotskyists or Tories who've joined the Labour Party for bad reasons or whatever over the summer. There are not tens of thousands of people in that situation. And I think the candidates need to get this in perspective. The candidates should be talking about what they stand for and not talking about who's joined the party over the summer. It's driving us all mad, this, and they need to. I think they need to get a grip of themselves and get it in perspective and go out and actually win the argument.
Okay, I'll stop talking about it. I promise.
Thank you.
Let's get some questions from the floor. Yes, Anne in the front row.
I wonder if we can take you a little bit further from the Labour Party and ask your view on two things. One, on the situation in Calais and how it's been handled, and secondly, on why it needs to take so long for the Chilcot inquiry to report.
Well, I think I am astonished at the Chilcot delays, because now successive Prime Ministers have promised that what happened, for example, over the Bloody Sunday inquiry wouldn't happen again. And I know there's a bit of tit for tat going on about who's responsible for setting out the remit of the inquiry and who's allowed Chilcot and his team to take this long to produce the report, and is it the fault of all the people who've appealed, or is it the fault of the inquiry itself? But frankly, all of this should have been thought about when the inquiry was first set up. The Bloody Sunday inquiry was, 11, 12 years or something like that? I mean, astronomical amount of money.
And 40 odd years after the event.
And it should have been possible to do this in a very different way. And the other thing is, it's very difficult for anybody to find out what's going on. I mean, I know one of the inquiry members fairly well, and that person has been scrupulous and not. Whenever I bump into them, I say, "Is something happened?" And given any hint about what the reason is, and I think the absence of a reason must be deeply frustrating particularly for the families who lost loved ones. On the situation in Calais, I mentioned earlier things that I'm proud about in relation to this country around the world, and I think we should talk about a lot more. I have to say that the emerging attitude to immigration in this country and to asylum seekers and refugees, and the way that our government talks about them, I am appalled by and embarrassed by everywhere I go. I think we have people, women, in jail in this country, having come to this country for asylum, to apply for asylum, rightly or wrongly, they could have a good case or no case, who have been in jail on an unlimited time, with children, in complete secrecy, and who could in fact have been subjected to abuse by their guards. Same company still running the facility in Yarrowswood down in Northamptonshire. This country, to me, the United Kingdom, whether we're all independent or we're all together or whatever, but to me, the UK in the 21st century has to stand for democracy, not just for tolerance, but for a celebration of diversity. We do it better than most parts of the world when we do it right. And we should recognise our international obligations. And we don't need to have a soft system of immigration and asylum applications to treat people properly with respect as human beings. And we are not doing that at the moment. And the situation at Calais has been developing for years. To be turning up yesterday and suddenly increasing the border guards and all this kind of stuff. What on earth has been going on over the last few years? This whole situation should have been better managed, but the language needs to change. I am embarrassed by the language that we use in this country, and we're feeding a beast here that will grow and grow and grow. The anti-immigration right-wing party in Sweden has just topped the opinion polls for the first time in Sweden. And if politicians of the moderate centre don't take a stand on these issues, and if they pander to extremes of public opinion, then the outcome of that is that these opinions grow and grow, and that is, you go back through history, everywhere. You talked about Sarajevo in your session earlier on. Sarajevo was a celebration of multicultural living. You go to the centre of Sarajevo, I don't know, you maybe missed this bit in your talk earlier. You go to the centre of Sarajevo, and the main mosque in Bosnia, the main Catholic cathedral, and the main Orthodox cathedral are within 100 metres of each other in the town square. And this is a country that tore itself apart over ethnic divisions, and yet they had lived like that for decades.
So Tito went and ate it.
Yep.
Well,
Tito might have had something to do with it as well.
No, they
in
had
terms of some of the legacy
they had a
that he left,
centuries-long tradition of peaceful
Yeah, they
coexistence,
did.
and there was
They
no
did, before
history.
Tito.
There was no history of intercommunal violence until
Yeah.
1914, when the first episodes occurred, and
Yeah.
then there was nearly a century of peaceful coexistence after that. Tito was not the cause of peace between peoples in Bosnia. Let me.
Yep.
take
Anyway,
a
sorry,
question
that was just
from
an
up there.
example. And that just shows how things can degenerate very quickly.
Yes.
Thank you very much. This is about nuclear disarmament and Trident. Your work is involved with conflict resolution and democratisation in countries around the world. In some polls, 70% of people in Scotland want to get rid of Trident. Would you have more credibility, and would your job be easier in the work you now do if you were a member of a party that said no to Trident?
Well, I would like to think that we could rebuild the Labour Party as a party that had multiple views on this, for example. I think one of the reasons we've got a problem as a party is that where people have views that haven't tied with the establishment and the party over the last couple of decades, they've gradually been squeezed out of the party rather than either voluntarily or otherwise. And I think that's very unhealthy. The Labour Party should be a much broader church than that, and should include a large number of people who are not just opposed to Trident, but believe in unilateral nuclear
Yeah,
disarmament.
but you've got to have a party policy. You've got to say what you're going to do
I'm
if
coming
you're
on to that,
if
but
you're
I'm
in
just saying,
government.
and the general assumption is that everybody has to agree with the policy. I'm just saying, I think you need to have a multiplicity of views. I said when they were looking at the decision to renew Trident back in whenever that was, late 2006, when I was still First Minister. At that time, I said that I thought one of the options that should be looked at was that the renewal of Trident should be included in the discussions with Iran and other emerging nuclear powers, and that Britain shouldn't voluntarily give up Trident and voluntarily decide not to replace Trident, but it should indicate a willingness not to if others would make concessions that would make that a good multilateral decision. And I still pretty much hold to that position. I'm not I would like to be in a position where we're not renewing Trident, but I think we're in a position of some responsibility where if we don't renew Trident, we should do that for a wider purpose. And I think there are now a number of emerging nuclear powers around the world that it would be good to persuade to be part of some kind of deal. Now, they've managed an Iranian deal without that negotiation, obviously, in that case, but there are others. Iran's not the only country in the world that's looking at these sorts of technologies. And I think I would like to take a responsible multilateral approach to this, a bit like the one that Obama is trying to take, which is to try and bring about decline, eventually elimination of nuclear weapons, but do it in some kind of agreed way. And while I think we should keep our options open on Trident at the moment, I would like to think that the British contribution to that could be not to renew Trident, if that makes sense.
If you've got a question,
That's just my personal view. That's not a party view. That's my own personal view.
Yeah.
You mentioned Syriza splitting next week, and what do you think will replace the Labour Party when if it does go and if it does split after the leadership election? Do you think it'll be something further left, or a sort of Blairite sort of organisation?
I think it's unpredictable, to be honest. I don't think anybody can really, because it would be such a new thing in British politics, I think it's hard to predict exactly what a Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour Party would do to British politics. It is possible that it would be it would have big difficulties, if I can put that diplomatically, with public opinion and with credibility and so on and so forth. But it's also possible that there might be 10, 20% of people out there who are not voting, and this is partly what's happened in Scotland over the last 12 months, there's 10, 20% of people out there who are not voting because they don't like the established parties. And they might well be motivated by him in the same way as they may be motivated. It all seems very strange, but yes, sometimes they're motivated by somebody like Boris Johnson or whatever, a captivating personality. And so I think it's unpredictable what would happen next. But I don't think there will be a significant split in the Labour Party, regardless of what actually happens. Some people might decline to be involved anymore, but I can't imagine two parties coming out of this in the near future. If it went on for a long time, then perhaps there might be a split. If we had a further left leadership, and it went on to the next election, and the result was bad, and the response to that was to have a continuation of that kind of leadership, or an even further left leadership, then at that point there might be a movement in the UK to create a centre-left party that fills the space. But I don't think that's imminent in the near future.
The difficulty is that whoever wins is going to look like a caretaker leader. Whoever wins is going to look like somebody who's just keeping the seat warm until a grown-up arrives. Really, it's
For that to be the case, there needs to be the grown-up in the background. I think that's the challenge. I mean, but it's a dire situation. It's a very, I mean, for those of us who've spent most of our adult lives trying to do something about helping the Labour Party be electable and then help change the country and so on and so forth, and you care about the issues that are involved, to be in a situation where there is, at least at this stage, there appears to be a lack of a credible Prime Minister. People can emerge and people can change, and that might well happen. But at the moment, I think it's not a happy place to be.
yes.
Yeah.
Question at the back there.
Excuse me.
Yep.
This young chap and I are campaigning today about the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership, which is a fairly, we think, shady deal that's been arranged behind closed doors, not informed. We haven't been involved in the participation of this, and I'm sure you understand what it represents in terms of large corporations from the US coming here and doing what they do over there, which many of us don't really like. So can you speak a little bit about how these things can take place, and how is it that many of the Labour politicians are telling us that's good news for our economy and for our people, and what do you think about it as well?
Well, I think is I think first of all, I think trade is good, and I think trade agreements are better than completely free trade. So I am in favour of trade agreements where they can be established, and I think bilateral trade agreements are good as well as global trade agreements. There's a place for bilateral trade agreements, particularly between big economies. So on one perspective, I'm very much in favour of trade agreements. What I am concerned about, and I don't oppose the transatlantic partnership in principle, but what I'm concerned about in relation to that agreement and other agreements that the European Union becomes involved in is a lack of engagement with the democratically elected politicians in individual countries in these agreements. I think the European Parliament has its place, and I accept that. It's an institution that is here and has its place to scrutinise the work of the European Union and the Commission. But I don't think it has the same clout or the same impact as national parliaments do. And I think one of the problems with not just the TTIP, but other EU trade agreements elsewhere in the world, whether they're with rich parts of the world or poor parts of the world, has been a lack of democratic scrutiny of those agreements and an input and ability to change them and improve them as they are being agreed. In general principle, not against the idea of a partnership and a trade agreement. In detail, I would like to see, as part of this debate that's going on just now about reforms in the European Union, I would like to see a greater opportunity for elected politicians to have more of an impact on the detail of these agreements before they're signed.
Let me ask you one last question, since there are no hands up now. There is a hand up.
Please, why do we import everything from China? Where is our balance of payments? Why they keep opening factories, carbon dioxide's up, Beijing's in fog, they won't accept to make, because they're a material society. What can we do to make change?
For those of you who didn't hear that, why do we import everything from China? And when China there was a pollution element to that question. I didn't hear anything because you haven't got the microphone. But why is everything made in China, Jack?
With respect to the audience, because you buy the stuff,
No, if we didn't have it, we wouldn't have it.
I know.
You think it should be banned? You think it should be banned?
I
do you?
You can't. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't think you can ban Chinese manufactured goods any more than you can ban cocoa made in Kenya or something like that. But I think the reality is it's 21st century. People, there is greater global choice, global trade, global finance than ever before. And what we need to do is find a way of getting the right balance between that and regulating it in the right ways, and justice, whether that's environmental justice or freedom of speech, democratic justice, or economic justice for people in individual countries. And yes, in this country, I would say even more so in countries where people are living below the extreme poverty line. I mean, if China has had an impact in our country in relation to jobs and manufactured goods and so on, it's nothing like the impact that it's had with its agreements to farm large parts of Africa on contracts that have been negotiated in some cases with leaders who are not accountable at all and who've probably pocketed some of the cash. So these international relationships need to be managed. And this, if I can just return to the whole issue of politics and political organisation and government, this is why politics is so important, and why when politicians lose their way, and people obviously then become disenchanted by that, but when politicians lose their way and get out of touch and become self-serving, we end up in situations where politics is not the force for good that it should be. And the only way to manage this international global economy in a way that is better than we have today is for politicians and politics to work better, not work worse, which is what's been happening over recent years. And I think anything that any of us can do to try and help that process, in my view, is important. Because without good politicians and good governments that are held accountable by the people, then these global problems are not going to be solved.
Jack, it's great to see you. Got to end there. Thank you very much indeed.